Some years ago, I would volunteer once a month over the night to be a hospital chaplain. And this hospital was in a city, so the majority of our time would be spent in the emergency room. I remember one situation very clearly. A gentleman had come in with a very severe heart attack, and then his family members started to arrive at the hospital. Now, this gentleman was the patriarch of a rather large family, and so various family members were arriving, but one of the first people to arrive was one of his sons, and he came to speak with me because we would put people that would arrive in a room, so the family had their own private space where they could be while the individual was in the emergency room. And so this brother came to speak to me and asked if the family could have 2 rooms. I initially assumed that it was a rather large family, and I said that to him. I said, "Oh, you must have a lot of family members coming." And he said, "Well, we do have a fair number of family members, but half of our family doesn't get along at all with the other half, and we don't talk to each other." I said, "Well, I would assume that given a situation like this, you may be able to look past that and be together and support each other as your father is in critical condition." He said, "No, we will need to be in 2 rooms." And so throughout the night, I would visit these 2 rooms to offer support to these 2 parts of the family. It was very interesting when I would go into one of the rooms. I was trying to give updates on their father's condition and, again, offer support and prayer. But they always seemed to be talking about people in the other room. They always seemed to be talking about some of the latest hurts or comments that had been made, something they felt was inappropriate that was done or said by somebody that was in that other group. It almost felt like the walls of those rooms were coming in on these individuals. I couldn't help but think, how did they get to this point? How did they get there? How did this family get to the place where they were broken in 2 and so many people cut off from each other? This morning in our passage, Jesus has something very specific to share. And maybe we could ask the question, how did Jesus get to this very specific instruction at a time when he was giving his opening speech? We once again are looking at a portion of the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount begins with what we often refer to as the Beatitudes. And these words were the opening statement of Jesus at the beginning of his ministry. And after he shared the Beatitudes, he started to explain a bit what he was referencing and how that might look in our lives. We talked last week about letting our lights shine, how these Beatitudes, this openness to the real presence of God, is to shine forth from our lives. Jesus talks about how we are to understand that his presence is not about doing away with the law that many people were familiar with. But now we come to a rather interesting section, because this is the first time Jesus now will give a very specific instruction to people. Jesus will tell people that if they are in the temple worshiping and offering a sacrifice, but they have an issue with someone, they are cut off, there is a problem in a relationship, they need to leave that sacrifice there and go make amends with that person. See, this stands out even at this very early point in the ministry of Jesus, as he's sharing this opening statement, because here Jesus gives this very specific instruction. How did we get to this instruction? Well, right before this section, Jesus mentioned that he has not come to abolish the law. Now, later in his ministry, Jesus would be cornered by the religious authorities and challenged on how can he summarize the law. And Jesus gives this very well-known summary. He says that we are to love God with our hearts, mind, and soul, and we are to love neighbor as ourselves. I believe with that understanding of what Jesus means by not coming to abolish the law, love of God and love of neighbor, we see how those come together in this first specific instruction Jesus gives us. He blends together worshiping and loving neighbors and loving others. He ties them together in a very clear manner. You can't separate loving God with heart, mind, and soul from loving another person. And you can't love another person unless you are loving God with heart, mind, and soul. And so he tells people, if you are making that sacrifice and if you have a cutoff in your life, you need to go make those amends. Murray Bowen is well known for being the one that really defined what we know now as family systems therapy. And Murray Bowen talked about 8 principles of family systems therapy, 8 key concepts that will impact our lives. And one of those concepts he talks about is cutoff. What happens to us emotionally when we are cut off from one of our family members? Or what happens to us emotionally if we are cut off from a close friend? Murray Bowen talks about the fact that if we have a cutoff, we then attempt to take the emotion that we might have put into that relationship and attempt to maybe put it into another relationship. If we have a cutoff, we have unresolved business within our lives. That's what I experienced with that family who needed to be in these 2 separate rooms. They were cut off from each other and so much seemed unresolved. Every time I would go in one of those rooms, they would need to discuss more and more how they were not the ones in the wrong. I think about our own lives. How is it that we have gotten to where we are with some of our relationships? See, Jesus says something else that's very interesting when he talks about this very specific commandment. He talks about being put in prison. See, I think if we follow the progression of what Jesus is sharing in this opening talk, what we come to see that if we have not made it right with another person, if we are not open to the very real presence of God, and if we are not open in our relationships but have closed some down, if we are cut off from some, we will in effect be putting ourselves in a prison. We will be building walls around ourselves and others. And there will be unresolved business that will take our energy and focus. There will be unresolved business that closes down our lives and that does not allow us to live a life that is for God and truly for others. How did we get here? How did we get to that place in some of our relationships? Well, we need to be cognizant of the need to make amends. I have a suggestion for you, something to think about. don't know if you've ever heard of the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error talks about the fact that when we're in relationship with other people or we're having a situation with another person, very often, if we're having a disagreement, we look at that other person and believe that the way they're acting or the things they're saying come from the fact that they have ill intent, that there's something wrong with their motives, that there's something wrong with their personality, that there's something wrong with just who they are as a person. But if we are the ones who are maybe saying something that isn't appropriate or isn't helpful, you know what we do? We say, when it comes to our own lives, that, well, it's the situation. It's the context. I'm an okay person. It's just that in this situation and this context, I needed to say that statement or I needed to act that way. See, we don't give other people that kind of grace. That's that fundamental attribution error. We take their behavior and maybe some of their comments and we say, well, that's just who they are. But when it comes to ourselves, we say, oh no, that's the situation, the circumstance. What if we, as a way to begin to make amends, understand this kind of grace? What if we understand that for other people, they too may be in certain situations, or maybe they have a context we don't understand, or maybe they have a history that is unknown to us. And we begin to share that kind of grace. See, when we are once again open, when we are willing to reach out in some form and just establish an engagement with another person, we begin to discover that authentic life that Christ intended for us. When we are willing to be open and allow the light of God's real presence to shine through each one of us. When we are willing to be open again in relationships, especially those that have been shut off or cut down, we remove ourselves from that prison maybe we've placed ourselves in. We remove ourselves and once again discover the authentic life that was intended for each one of us. To God be the glory. Amen.